Good afternoon, and welcome to another edition of Room for Discussion. Today we'll be talking about one of the most urgent challenges of our time, the unchecked power of Silicon Valley and its impact on democracy from Washington to Brussels and beyond.
The recently published book, The Tech Coup, sounds the alarm on how big tech has shifted from being seen as a force for good to an unregulated power center that has the ability to shape public policy, influence elections, and even affect global security, often without democratic oversight. In this hour, we'll dive into the risks of this technological free-for-all and ask the question, can democracy survive the dominance of big tech? And if so, what do we have to do to rein it in?
For these questions and more, we'll be honored to welcome Marietje Schaake to our stage. She was a former MEP for D66 in the European Parliament, the former chair of the International Policy Center at Stanford, and an advisor to the global geopolitical risk consulting firm Eurasia Group, among many other things. And we'll dive into these topics and more in just a moment.
So please join us in giving a warm welcome to Marietje Schaake.
Thank you very much.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Have a seat.
Thank you. Yep. Hi, everyone.
Is Marietje fine? Marietje, Ms.
Yes,
Schaake?
first name basis is always good.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Well, Marietje, welcome back to your old stomping grounds. You studied American studies right here at the UvA, long before diving to the deep end of tech and democracy. Given your experience and your background, do you think that the development and the dominance of Silicon Valley, with its odd mix of libertarian ethos, government backing, appetite for risk, could have only happened in the US? Could it have blossomed elsewhere?
I'm afraid that what we're seeing is the product of many typically American problems. The role of money in politics, the lack of regulation, including of tech companies, a big trust that letting the markets, letting companies to their own devices would render the best results, not only for the economy, but also for society, is a belief that is very strong in the United States between Democrat-led and Republican-led governments for decades. So this is not just a Trump phenomenon. This is the product of very little democratic governance to make sure that there are guardrails, to make sure that there are proper checks and balances and oversight mechanisms of this sprawling set of companies that are now, taking the next frontier of power that they can grab, and that is that of the state and of American politics.
But so could it have blossomed elsewhere? Or
well,
in the way
I
that
don't
we've
think
seen
of it as blossoming. So I think that what is happening now between Elon Musk and Donald Trump is an absolute disaster. Right. There are conflicts of interest of a magnitude that we haven't seen before, and that are changing US politics, but also hollowing out key state capabilities. Because, when I wrote the book, The Tech Coup, there were some people who said, oh, well, maybe the word coup is a little bit strong. Are you sure that this is what we're facing? And now I hear people saying maybe the word coup doesn't even cover it, because a coup suggests a takeover. And what's actually happening is not only a takeover, but then a sort of destruction from within. And so this phenomenon is a product of a combination of American political choices and Silicon Valley, which is unique to the United States. That's not to say that there aren't very powerful tech companies elsewhere, but what we're seeing now, the combination of Donald Trump and his agenda, some powerful Silicon Valley actors, be they crypto entrepreneurs, be they venture capitalists like Mark Andreessen, or be they radical libertarians like Peter Thiel or Elon Musk. It creates a sort of cocktail that is American politics right now. And as Europeans, we have a lot to be concerned about. As people who believe in democracy, we have a lot to be concerned about. And as someone who believes that there should be more independent oversight and guardrails and more public interest consideration of what role tech should play in our society, I'm deeply worried.
Mm-hmm. And so you often mention the Pegasus project as this sort of pivotal moment in the public's understandings of what technology could mean for democracy and the implications that it could have. For those of us that might need a refresh, could you remind us what the project actually revealed and what made the findings so significant, especially when considering the role of democratic norms in the digital age?
Sure. So one of the ways in which tech companies have amassed an incredible amount of power is by creating technologies that put pressure on core human rights or democratic principles. And one of the technologies that I've unfortunately had to focus on for over 15 years right now is that of hacking tools and spyware. I came across many activists in the Middle East when I was working on foreign policy as a newly elected member of European Parliament 15 years ago, when they were telling me about their devices having been hacked, their contacts having been traced. They worried about what they had posted on social media and how it could be used against them and so on. But for a lot of people, this spyware market, which is probably one of the most toxic markets in the whole tech ecosystem, only became clear when a group of investigative researchers published the Pegasus Project, which was a specific investigation into Pegasus, which is a product by NSO Group, which is an Israeli spyware company, probably one of the best, meaning sophisticated producers of spyware, intelligence-grade technologies that have been sold around the world or have ended up all over the world and have also been used in Europe, unfortunately, because the story is always, well, this kind of tracking of people's communications and contacts is very helpful for police and law enforcement when they are looking for mobsters, mafia, organized crime suspects or terrorist suspects. The worst of the worst kind of crimes would benefit from this kind of surveillance capabilities. But when you look at the practice of how Pegasus and other kinds of spyware end up being used, it gets used against opposition leaders, as happened in Poland, or judges, as happened in Poland, but also in countries like Greece and Spain and Hungary was this technology used, including against journalists, to intimidate, to investigate their sources, which is, of course, absolutely against the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the EU, where press freedom should be respected. And so my concern with the existence of this kind of technology without proper safeguards in the rules that we have is that it is indeed so prone to be abused, and that we see proliferation, meaning an uncontrolled spread of this technology, and that the whole argument that spyware is used to go after organized crime and terror doesn't hold, because it actually ends up in many different places being used against every rule of law spirit and democratic spirit that we should stand for.
I mean, these sorts of Pegasus itself was developed by an Israeli firm, but European companies have also had similar sorts of technologies that they've exported, you mentioned in your book,
Yep.
to the Iranian regime, for example. How should the EU be reconciling democratic values with the fact that our own companies are exporting these sorts of tools to autocracies?
So when I was first elected as a member of European Parliament around 15 years ago, I indeed learned by talking to people in the Middle East that it was European companies that were exporting spyware. And then we did start the process of at least curbing the exports of these kinds of technologies to regimes that were known to be violators of human rights. And so we did put in place some export controls. The Biden administration thankfully also did. And so we've seen some different steps of how we can restrict the use of these technologies. In the EU, we focused on exports, but of course that did not prevent domestic use, like the examples that I mentioned. And in the US, recently, this was like 2 years ago, the Biden administration signed an executive order, which is actually really important step where it said the US government will no longer use commercial spyware. And what that does is, obviously it sets a moral standard by saying we, the government, are not going to use this off-the-shelf kind of technology for law enforcement, for example. But it also sort of dries up that market. And so in the case of the United States, one can argue, well, they certainly have some government-made technologies that have the same capabilities, so it's not like the spying doesn't happen, it just doesn't happen with commercial spyware. And in Europe, we focused on the export. So, I mean, if you would have these two measures combined, restricting the use by governments in the EU, restricting the exports, then you would cover quite a bit of ground. But of course, the Trump administration has now revoked this executive order, so apparently no problem for him to see commercial spyware flourishing again.
So in your book, you really focus on the threats of big tech and their technologies on democracies. But what you were just getting at of this is not a problem that is solely faced by governments, but we also see private sector abuses. So how do you differentiate between the risks posed by governments, like in the case of Pegasus, versus private companies?
So my criticism of the abuse of power, as expressed in the Tech Coup, the book, is directed at the private sector, but also at democratic governments who have allowed these companies to become so big and so powerful, and indeed have been tempted to use technology for their own entrenching of power or just providing of government services, but yet again without the proper safeguards. So I think when we talk about regulation, we have to appreciate that it's often also intended to keep the government in check. The way we hear discussion about regulation now, especially when you listen to lobbyists from Silicon Valley, they like to frame it as a hammer with which European governments go after the big companies. But of course, when you look at what laws are intended to do, they're intended to protect people from the abuse of power, be it by governments or by companies. Think about the spirit of the General Data Protection Regulation. We can also have a critical discussion about how well that law has actually worked out. But in any case, the idea here is that governments should treat your personal data within the confines of the law, and so should companies. And so a lot of people in Silicon Valley think that GDPR was really designed as a weapon to shoot at Silicon Valley with. They don't appreciate that it actually applies to the pool, to the university, to the library, to everyone. I think that's typically how we also make sure that governments do not overstep either their own power or extensions of their power through outsourcing certain critical tasks to tech companies.
But so to back up a little bit, you argue that a large part of the reason that, or the reason for the risks that are posed was this longstanding belief in the democratizing potential of technology, right? So how does this sentiment of tech as a force for good stand today, do you think?
Well, so I still think that technology had the potential to be a democratizing force, but the big mistake was to believe that it was a self-fulfilling prophecy. So the mistake was to think if we don't do anything, it will lead to good outcomes. That, of course, has not worked out. But this is still a belief, utopianism, for example, that people in Silicon Valley, not everybody, but some key players there have. Meaning that they really think that to any problem, there is a phenomenal tech solution. And I think that trusting that the effects of technology will be automatic without clear steering in a democratic, democratizing, rule of law respecting, human rights enhancing direction is just a flawed theory. If you look at the practice, it doesn't work out that way. Mm-hmm. And so we really also have to challenge the tech companies that say to American lawmakers right now, we have competition from China. Let us, the companies, be unregulated to be your best defense of democracy in light of authoritarian threats. This is the argument that's incredibly popular in the United States. But if you look even at their own examples, transparency reports by companies like Apple and Google, you see that these companies are actually not standing up against authoritarian orders to censor. Or if you look at their behavior, there is no proof that they are so squarely in favor of democracy that they will defend it. And I think an ultimate test is happening as we speak, because on the front rows of Donald Trump's inauguration were the CEOs of major tech companies, of Amazon, of Google, of OpenAI, of Apple. And so these companies have kissed the ring. Mark Zuckerberg, of course, was there too, of Meta/Facebook. These companies have done an unprecedented embrace of any political leader. And they should also face consequences, because make no mistake, there is a full-on confrontation between the United States and Europe, where they used to be allies for the past decades. Most of us, including our parents and some of your grandparents, cannot remember a time where the US and the EU were not broadly aligned. We can have discussions about, challenges in that relation, but let's look at it through a broad lens for a moment. This was a bedrock alliance of security for the European continent, of economic cooperation, and of broad political alignment. It is gone. And this will have devastating consequences, and the tech companies are cheering this on. And so we cannot treat these tech companies as if nothing happened. And I really think that we need to be very much aware of that they will become the tools that will be weaponized. They will become the pressure points in a trade war, and we are incredibly dependent on them. So we have a serious problem across the Atlantic, and we have a serious problem with the tech companies that have kind of become the tools of choice in this standoff between the Trump White House and Europe. And I honestly wish it wasn't so, but this is where we are, and it's better that we face reality in its harshest, coldest, most terrible way right now than that we blur our vision, romanticize, get nostalgic about the past, because that past does not exist anymore.
We're going to come back to this question of tech companies aligning with US foreign policy, as well as the thinkers in Silicon Valley in just a moment, but I'd like to come back to a comment you made earlier about governments outsourcing critical functions to these private tech firms. Who holds them accountable when things go wrong? Is just we're throwing democratic oversight just totally out of the window?
I mean, when there are some rules, there are some rules like data protection.
Say Amazon with the cloud infrastructure hosting in the U.S. federal government, or these Starlink satellites above Ukraine. What sort of democratic oversight do we have?
Very little. So we obviously have rules on the books, like competition rules that also apply to an Amazon. We have rules around data protection that apply to everyone, as we've just discussed. But I think the significant problem is that for a lot of services that governments have outsourced, there is not a clear path of transparency, for example, of clarity on who has access to information, and on what the obligations are when it comes to providing secure services, for example. I mean, it's astonishing to me how often we hear of data breaches or cyber attacks being successful when they've impacted the same companies that basically service our entire governments. We also have more and more integration between different functions by companies. So the tech companies that are providing government services, like our databases, our communications, are also building critical infrastructure, are also scanning the infrastructure for risk, are also offering cybersecurity products. And so we've done serial outsourcing, not just specific services, but almost everything. And as a result, that has created enormous dependencies, but it has also created a lack of information and knowledge on the part of governments themselves, which makes it harder to have independent information about what even goes on the networks. And so I think we must see it as dependencies as impacting our own European economic investments, success, impacting our national security, but also impacting our information position. And the latter, I think, is undervalued, underappreciated when we look at the relationship between the government and the private sector, because you can quickly get a spiral that looks something like this. We've outsourced a lot of tech to the private sector. Therefore, we have fewer people working in government that know or understand these technologies. Therefore, when there's a new wave, let's say artificial intelligence, a new wave of technology that we have to make a decision about, there are fewer people in the government that have the capacity, and so it becomes easier to buy the next product off the market. And then for the next wave of a new technology, we have fewer people in the government who understand artificial intelligence. And so, it's a self-fulfilling process that happens through the outsourcing of ever more functions to market players, because it hollows out the capacities in the public sector and the government, yeah.
Right, so you've written a lot about what we've seen the past couple of months with Silicon Valley's ties to Washington really seeming to deepen. How do you respond to, you mentioned some earlier, figures like Sam Altman, also one of the biggest venture capitalists, Mark Andreessen, who argue that unrestricted technological progress might require the reconsideration of our social contract or even democracy itself?
Well, I wish they would say it so clearly, but they actually claim that unrestricted growth of their own companies will be good for everybody, will actually protect democracy, will lead to the solutions of anything from the climate change problem to cancer, will lead to enormously positive scientific breakthroughs. So I think the promise and the hype on the part of some of these CEOs and investors is significant. But of course, we have to understand that their responsibility and their agenda is towards scaling, towards maximum profit, towards market dominance, and towards shareholder value. Governments have a very different obligation, which is to balance different needs in society. Sure, we want to have an innovative economy that thrives, but we also need to protect people's fundamental rights. We need to decide how much investment in healthcare, how much investment in education, how to have our armed forces up to speed. So a government has a much broader palette of responsibilities that is not only articulated in economic results, that is sometimes going to mean a bit of slowing down because we need to weigh and listen to different groups of people in society. And so governments are steering towards completely different outcomes than these companies are. And that's why we should not assume that what these CEOs say is good for us is actually what's going to benefit everybody in society. And so I'm a big believer that we need to have more capabilities on the part of governments to shape our agendas, to understand the technology itself, and to make these choices. But in the meantime, we need to just understand which stakeholder represents which interest. And I look at this in a sort of company agnostic way. I don't really care if we're listening to Sam Altman or Mark Zuckerberg or someone else, because I think we need to just see the principles of the different interests of what these private companies want versus what's good for the public. And even if Elon Musk was not the Trump whisperer in chief right now, I would still be very worried. If Elon Musk had the same relationship to Kamala Harris had she won the elections, I would still be very worried. So I think we need to understand the principal problem that this capture and this dominance of business interests in our democracy presents, and not necessarily tie it to one CEO or the other.
But this question of business capture, I think it goes a little beyond that. We have some, this blogger, this tech blogger, Curtis Yarvin, once obscured, now he's making headlines. He said in an interview with the New York Times recently, the problem is when people equate democracy with good governance. This sort of thinking is out there. Vice President Vance quoted him as an influence. What does this indicate about the shifting political winds that see these sorts of once obscure voices are now really at the heart of public debate?
Well, it represents a stepping away from the pillars of the rule of law and a rules-based international order by the United States of America, inspired by a very radical ideology that is in some ways against the state, which is, it takes a while to process how people who have responsibility for state institutions are actually interested in destroying them. And so I think we see a challenge also with the American institutional design that is not developed with the idea that somebody may come with a sledgehammer to destroy it. There's an assumption of a basic respect for the rules that create the checks and balances, create the separation of powers between different forces in the US government. But if those rules are not respected, then all bets are off. And I think that that's what we're looking at right now.
And you mentioned about the destruction of government by these sorts of powers that want to control government. Can we draw any historical parallels here? Can we look at how companies like the United Fruit Company dictated US foreign policy in the 19th century? Is that an apt comparison, or is this a really unique moment?
I hear a lot of people in interviews asking me, but this is nothing new. We've had the robber barons, we've had the big companies, oil, cars, etc. in the past. But the challenge is we live today. Technology companies have very different products and services than a car that rolls off of a conveyor belt. These are companies that have enormous access to information about all of us, that have data profiles about us, that have a deep understanding of how our societies run, our governments, our transport. So it's hard to compare because the dependencies are deep and wide. So it's not just a matter of, we should just find an alternative mode of transportation, or we should find an alternative mode of using energy. It is a much vaster and more deeply penetrated kind of dependence that we're facing now. And it is a very confrontational politics that we see coming out of the United States. So to me, those historic comparisons with a century ago or so are not necessarily helping me understand the moment that we're in. I think we have to appreciate the uniqueness of where we are. The only thing that I can hope we do again, as we did about a century ago, is put in place better guardrails against this abuse of power, against this use of state institutions for private corporate benefits, the way we gained antitrust and competition rules about a century ago. But it will be a lonely task on the part of European societies and its allies to fulfill this enormous filling of the gap between what the reality asks for and where the regulatory framework is. Without US political leadership, everything that needs to happen to rein in the overly powerful tech companies has become a whole lot more difficult.
We'll come back to that question about what we in Europe need to do in just a moment. I'd like to move to the audience to see if there are any questions. Someone will come to you with a microphone. Gentleman with the green hat here in the front.
Okay, yeah. Thanks for those interesting insights. And I wanted to ask you questions about how we can possibly deal with those issues that you speak about, because I think we don't really have that time. And this dependency that we have to the US is a fatal flaw in our security architecture, and we're being sandwiched by the Russians and the Americans right now with the peace negotiation of the Ukraine war. We can kind of feel what is going to happen, and I think if we speak about the lengthy process, I do think that we are kind of being colonized by American interests. What are we doing about that?
So I'm glad you brought up Ukraine. Of course, we're talking here about tech policy, and the Ukraine war, the war that Russia started there as an invasion, war of aggression, is related to the transatlantic relations. Not the core topic that we're talking about today, but I'm glad you brought it up because it speaks to the context within which the capture of our tech ecosystem and our dependency on the United States for security guarantees, for example, is hitting us now from all different directions. I agree with you, we don't have time to lose, and it's incredibly important to be focused, to see political leadership that also talks to the population of this country, of other EU countries, about what will be needed. That business as usual is just impossible, that we're going to have to significantly increase our defense spending, maybe even go to a war economy, where the full focus is on building that defense capacity. I mean, the day Russia started the war against Ukraine, it started a war economy. And here we pretended like this was a faraway issue on the front lines, and that if we could just support the Ukrainians, that they could solve this for us. This is no longer possible. With the Americans siding with the Kremlin, because that's what's happening, we are in a different world, and our political leaders have to bring the population along. It will ask enormous sacrifices from all of us compared to what we've lived in our lifetime. I mean, I think, you know, we're a wealthy society, a lot should be possible, but we need to be brought there. And it will mean investing in defense, it will mean working in new alliances, it will mean investing in alternative, more autonomous European tech stack, what people think of as a Euro stack. And so, yes, it will be an uphill battle. But as people remind me when I sound too concerned, is that European leaders can move mountains under pressure. So, you know, we must expect Mont Blanc capabilities to be unlocked yesterday.
I think a follow-up here. Is the follow-up or a different question?
So I've studied computational social science. I think I know a lot about technology, and I think Europe actually has a lot of innovative minds in terms of technology. Also, the Netherlands, it has a foundation that is also supported by the European Union that supports a lot of very good open source projects that do exactly what we kind of need, but lack the political support. Are there any serious attempts from the European Parliament to finally promote European innovators in terms of technology?
So I fully agree with you that we don't have a problem with the lack of talent. Of course, it doesn't help that the government of this country is cutting resources for higher education, such as the University of Amsterdam, where we're sitting right now. It's a disgrace at a time where we actually need to build out our own flourishing tech ecosystems that consist of talent coming out of higher education, investment, and a smooth pathway to market. And typically our entrepreneurs end up going to Silicon Valley when they need capital. And so one of the key priorities for the EU, also after the Draghi report, is to make sure that a capital markets union is created, meaning it will be easier for people to have access to capital across the EU according to the same conditions. And so there is serious thinking in the slipstream of this Draghi report with the rude awakening of what the United States has become and how our tech dependencies are crippling and dangerous. And so I do think that sort of the core ingredients are there, but now they have to be brought together into an operationalized pathway. So it's one thing to talk about, you know, unprecedented investments like Draghi does, 800 billion euros of injection into the European economy. It's another thing to talk about a Euro stack, but it has to be broken down in, okay, what money is going to go where and how can we make this happen? But it's great that there are people like you with the skills that you have and with the confidence that you have in, you know, your peers that are working on open source and other solutions in Europe, because that's exactly what we need. I hope that some of you will also find the energy to knock on the doors of political parties to elevate this topic on the Dutch agenda, but also for the Dutch government to elevate this topic on the European agenda, because we all know that with the help of, you know, Trumpian-style political parties in our own country, we are hindered, we are slowed down to be, you know, the leaders with this support for European alternatives, because some people in this country still believe that the Netherlands can go this alone, which, you know, is a huge mismatch with the moment we live in, but that's the politics that they support. So it is critical that people like yourselves, I'm not saying you, but like all of you, Do not turn your backs against politics, but try to continue to encourage political leaders to do more and to represent you better.
Thank you. This woman in the back with the green sweatshirt. I like green today. Sue me.
Thank you. So you talked about what we need to do, like what governments need to do, and what the dangers right now are, and what can normal citizens do apart from electing governments who will do better? Like, yeah, can we just observe? That's all.
Ideally, people will do more, make different choices as consumers, encourage the university to make different choices when it comes to their dependency on big tech companies. Get involved with civil society organizations is another thing that's super helpful. And I also think a certain amount of mental preparation is going to be necessary. I mean, I know this sounds pretty bad to a generation that has already suffered the consequences of mismanagement of the climate, the COVID pandemic and the fallout of that, an economy that doesn't automatically mean more prosperity for the next generation, challenges to getting housing. I teach students like yourself, and I know these are anxious times for a lot of young people. It will get worse. Yeah, and I hate to say this. I mean, I'm also, a citizen that has to deal with this reality. But I think it's really important to sort of try to calibrate the moment that we're in and get active. Get active. Anything but be paralyzed. I think that's the most important thing. I've talked to a lot of American friends, some of them who are, typically very engaged in society. They may live in cities like New York that obviously feel like islands in the reality vis-a-vis Washington, for example. And when I ask, how are you coping, what are you doing? Some of them have literally said, I've stopped looking at the news, I've checked out. And while I understand it, it's numbing. I'm also quite dizzy of everything that's going on. Do not check out. Find your own way of engaging, be it with civil society, be it with friends, be it in the university, in student bodies, with political parties, with tech groups that can build better stuff, that can inform students of what switches they can make to other kinds of platforms. Do not check out.
On that note, thank you very much to the audience. I think we're going to move back to, or move forward, looking at Europe, actually. So we've spent a lot of time talking about the US, understandably. But with American advancements, China's DeepSeek, Europe really does seem to be feeling the heat as this global tech regulator, if we can say. You mentioned the last year's Draghi report that pointed out that catching up with American innovation is one of the core challenges facing the EU, but then at the same time, the EU still seems to be very focused on maintaining these robust regulations. And I think there are a lot of people that feel like these two goals or priorities are at odds with one another. Do you see it the same way?
Well, I hear a lot of this rhetoric, but I think we have to really look at where we are. So some of the most serious tech regulations in the EU are very new. They are of the last 3-4 years. The AI Act is not even in force yet. The Digital Markets Act, Digital Services Act have just entered into force. So it is impossible to say, 20 years of differentiation between, let's say, GDP or growth in the EU versus the US can be attributed to these handful of laws that have just entered into force. Yes, we have barriers. I think it's interesting for those of you who are wanting to assess this a little bit more deeply. Mario Draghi again wrote an interesting op-ed in Financial Times a couple of days ago, where he said, forget about the US and the tariffs that it may impose on us. The EU, by failing to harmonize its internal market, is doing more to hinder its collaboration and collective strength than what those tariffs can be. And he basically assessed what the barriers in the internal market mean if they would be compared to tariffs. And so the EU should help itself by working together better. But this comes at a moment where, of course, nationalism is in vogue here too. And so it will mean that this further European integration, which is vital to everything that we just talked about, is difficult. And so I think for a lot of thinkers, economists, tech policy experts, defense experts, political scientists, what needs to happen is pretty clear. The political reality is a difficult one. And there is also a design flaw, if you will, if you look at the European Union, which is national security is a national competence. And so while we're trying to integrate the market, trying to build a digital single market, have a Charter of Fundamental Rights that applies equally, we have 27 different understandings of what national security threats look like. In China and in the US, national security concerns drive the strategic agenda. Investments in tech, space for tech companies, utilizing of tech in defense contexts, and so on. And so even if we didn't have to deal with this fragmented political reality, the fact that this is how the EU is set up makes it harder to create that integrated approach that brings together national security, economy, and rights issues, and that is exactly what is needed. So what I hope is that the new sense of urgency that this moment presents will mean that bridges can be built across this fragmentation, because actually what individual member states stand to lose from not working together will be bigger than what they fear they would lose from working better together. And so they will have to, I think it was President Macron that said, get some shock therapy. But we're not quite there yet. I mean, the summit yesterday and the different communications didn't exactly show that they have found a sense of shared purpose entirely yet.
On this question of, I mean, you can talk about the questions of shared purpose and shared national or security interests, but when it comes to getting the investment you need, I think this was brought up earlier in your question, in your response to the question from the audience about the harmonization of capital markets in Europe. Can you walk us through that a little more on how that can help spur innovation?
So one of the challenges for companies is to have a predictable climate of entrepreneurship. So I've heard from entrepreneurs that, for example, first of all, getting access to venture capital, so very risk-tolerant capital, is hard. It's easier in the United States. And of course, it's not just these entrepreneurs that are thinking, hey, let's go to the United States. There's active recruiting and policies to really try to get all those successful entrepreneurs over to the US. And similarly, I think what needs to happen now, the EU, the Netherlands, needs to try to bring talent that wants to leave the United States over here in a smooth way. You know, think about people in the queer community that are not feeling safe. Think about immigrants. The tech companies are full of immigrants and workers from all over the world, and so is the US government. You know, there are so many functions that the US is now abandoning, so many people that the US government is now abandoning, that we need to step in to turn this into an opportunity for us. You know, things don't just happen organically. We need to also work to bring that talent here. Another issue when you talk about capital markets that I hear about from entrepreneurs, for example, there is a big difference in what it means to go bankrupt in different European countries. Now, of course, no entrepreneur hopes to go bankrupt, don't get me wrong, but when you talk to entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley, they've almost all started companies that have failed before they found, you know, their better formula or their better success story. And if you go bankrupt and you can get back on your feet again in an easy way, that is different from a process that some people have told me may take up to 7 years to finish. So, you know, it's about things like that. How can we harmonize the rules? How can we facilitate access to capital in a predictable and easier way across the union, so that when a company succeeds in, I don't know, Sweden, it can as well reach consumers in Portugal, and that those barriers that still remain are smoothed out.
So last week or the past couple of weeks, we've seen a lot of really important moments or developments. Let's say we had the conference in Munich over the weekend, but about a week and a half ago, we also saw the AI summit in Paris, where we saw both the US and the UK refuse to sign this international declaration on AI, which had the purpose of promoting accessibility and making sure that tech development is transparent and safe. I think after our conversation, the American position on this is relatively unsurprising. But what do you make of the UK's refusal to sign it?
Yeah, I was surprised actually because it's the UK that actually started the launch of an AI Safety Institute that hosted the Bletchley Park conference on AI. I was there with all the big AI leaders, Sam Altman, Elon Musk. All of them were there along with political leaders because there was a real moment of appreciation for the fact that AI is a highly disruptive technology that also brings new risks. In fact, we, society, was warned for a number of these risks by the AI entrepreneurs and by the AI experts. They were penning letters saying, pause AI. They were penning letters saying, regulate AI. In fact, when Sam Altman came before the US Congress, he said, this is a technology that needs regulation. And now these same CEOs are standing behind, cheering on and supporting a US president that has a deregulatory agenda. We have the US and the UK government not signing a declaration which, for all intents and purposes, was mostly focused on safety. And just because some words like preventing AI from discriminating against people or contributing to a sustainable world probably flew in the face of the White House because, only wants to talk about discrimination against tech companies by Europe now and not discrimination against sensitive categories, for example. So what can I say? I think it's petty politics, and I think the UK needs to understand who it wants to be. I was very surprised that a left-leaning government has been so embracing of tech companies, only focused on bringing investments to the United Kingdom, not so much focused on the needed regulatory landscape. So I think it's misguided.
So another really important part in conversations about regulation is accountability, right? And so last year in the Romanian elections, we saw a clear weaponization of tech platforms. Does Europe do enough to hold companies accountable for foreign interference? And what can be further done to protect democratic processes from things like algorithmic manipulation and disinformation?
So one of the problems that we still have, despite having the Digital Services Act, which deals with content moderation, is that there's too little information on how algorithmic amplification works in practice. And so when you dive deeper into the discussion about, social media companies, what are the risks, why is certain content potentially harmful, be it for public health when you think about a pandemic, be it about hatred against certain people or the spreading of terrorist or violent content. The people like Elon Musk, who runs X, but also others, are often very keen to talk about free speech. In fact, one of the allegations in Munich, where I also spent the weekend, by the vice president was that Europe doesn't respect free speech. The problem with thinking about social media platforms and potential harms on them only in terms of speech puts aside the core of the business models, which are about algorithmic amplification. It's not just about what you're allowed to say or not allowed to say, and thank God we have very strong protection of free speech in Europe as well. But it's really about how does information reach its audience? Why do certain messages go viral? Why do people end up seeing certain things? The case in Romania was interesting in that sense, unique in many ways, because there was a candidate to the elections that had no media profile, which is a sort of situation that we typically don't have. Most people that run for elections have some sort of media profile, certainly in the US presidential election. both candidates would be very, very well known, will get a lot of television coverage, newspaper, radio, all kinds of media coverage. And that makes it harder to understand exactly what factor of influence social media really have, even though, more and more people consume their information only online, only on social media. But in the Romanian case, there was evidence of foreign interference, yes, but we also now have a requirement by the EU, facilitated by the Digital Services Act, that requires TikTok to do data retention on a whole bunch of details of what happened around the election in Romania. And I think studying that data will hopefully teach all of us more about the exact impact of algorithmic amplification. Because the problem is this: if we underestimate the impact of disinformation or foreign interference, that puts us in a bad place for protecting democracy. But if we overestimate it, it also puts us in a bad place, because we may get very scared that we can't believe anything we see anymore online, even though it may actually have minimal impact. So it's very important that we understand better what the impact of algorithmic amplification is, and hopefully the DSA and the way that the European Commission is now looking into the case in Romania, but also in Germany, actually, Elon Musk's impact and the X algorithm will hopefully teach us broader lessons about algorithmic amplification. And I'm personally in favor of doubling down on more transparency on the business models and getting away from this, what I call a speech trap. Because if we think only about the freedom of speech element, considering the way speech is protected in the United States, we miss a whole bunch of the broader context, the conflicting rights that exist, not just the right to freedom of expression, but also democratic rights in the context of elections, or the right not to be discriminated against, or things like that. And so hopefully with this transparency from the DSA, we can learn more that will benefit everybody to understand better what algorithmic amplification does and does not do, so that we don't have to speculate as much.
So in the last chapter of your book, you set out some solutions to this tech coup that we've witnessed. And so would you provide us an outline of the ones that you find now the most important, given also the developments of the past 6 months or so? And are you still hopeful in these solutions that you've put forth?
Well, I think the last 6 months have changed the context that we have to work in dramatically. And so I think we can summarize the solutions in one main objective for governments that want to protect the rule of law, is that their key strategic objective must be to reclaim the primacy of governance over everything digital. I'll say it again. Governments have to reclaim the primacy of governance over everything digital. And that then will inform a whole lot of other discussions and decisions, So, what investments in a Euro stack? What kind of oversight when services are outsourced? What kind of information flow back to governments about the services that they've outsourced, so that they can maintain an information position of understanding operations, technologies, and the impact on society, and so on and so forth. More transparency in the public interest, access to information for academics like yourselves. So I still, think that there are useful pointers towards solutions in the book, but without the United States as a potential supporter of democratic governance of technologies, this puts a lot more pressure on the EU to make that happen. Pressure that we already see on enforcement of existing EU law. Hopefully a pressure that will lead to more investments in Eurostack and European alternatives. But these are incredibly challenging times, about which I can only hope the wake-up shock that some of the political leaders have needed has now happened, and will lead to unprecedented action, because the world has dramatically changed over the past month since Donald Trump is in office. And just think about it, it's only been a month. So maybe we should meet again in 1 year and take stock. There's a lot going on, but it's important to support each other in these difficult times, to be active and not check out, and to look for ways in which you can encourage more and better political leadership, more and better European anchoring of democratic principles also in the way we use technology, and really challenge the choices that you yourselves make, that the organizations that you're involved with, whether it's your job or your university or your political party or another sort of network that you're in, can really think about becoming less dependent on companies that may soon be weaponized against us, that may soon be the front runners in a trade war with the EU, as we've seen. You know, Mark Zuckerberg really cheering on the White House to impose consequences for the EU for just standing up for the laws that it has democratically adopted. These are moments of enormous shifts. If some of you are writers, or in other way documenters of this moment in time, I think that can be another really, really important thing to do, is to just write down what you're seeing. You know, to sort of have a sense of it for yourself, but also to, you know, make sense of the period of time that we're in. Because another thing that will suffer under these tectonic shifts is, of course, trustworthy information. We're not getting trustworthy information from the White House. The White House is weeding out what media gets access to information. Social media platforms are used to lie and amplify the lies. So even having a sense of what is going on is going to become harder. And so even if it's just observing the world around you, you know, being together with peers and friends to support each other, I think those are very important ways, even if they're, you know, in your own realm, to sort of stay strong in these difficult times. I'm sorry I don't have a more hopeful message for you right now.
Just closing up the interview, Nick Clegg sat where you're sitting just about a year ago, and he told us that engaging with technology is about sharing photos of babies, barbecues, and bar mitzvahs.
Yep.
But of course, we've been talking about a whole different story today. How do you think we can prove Clegg wrong, and how can we avoid bringing a knife to this gunfight?
I hope I'm still with you. Nick Clegg has left his role since. I think you know. He's been replaced by a Republican who said in Munich this weekend that they will not hesitate to call the White House if they feel like they've been discriminated against by European lawmakers. You know, the story of sharing photos of important moments in people's lives shields the reality that social media companies are hoarding data about us, are, certainly in the case of Facebook, now stepping away from what used to be called trust and safety. So making sure that your online experiences are not laced with hatred, with disinformation, and other kinds of harmful stuff that also has the effect of impacting trust between people, increasing polarization, sharing manipulation by foreign actors, or even fraudulent stuff. I mean, not everything is political. The kind of fraud that happens online, you know, deception, selling nonsensical stuff to you, is also impacted by, you know, not having these trust and safety teams. You know, whatever Facebook might have been up until now, it is now a cheerleader for Donald Trump and his policies that are fundamentally anti-democratic and anti-European. So we need to step away from the idea that this is about like sharing our lives and just connecting with friends. Please connect with your friends over dinner. Forget about fostering these platforms and being overly romantic about what they are. They are now tools in a geopolitical and political confrontation with Europe, with democratic principles. And we cannot be naive and certainly not fall for the kind of description that Nick Clegg had last year. In fact, it would have been great to hear his frank thoughts on where the company is now. I hear he has a book coming out. I hope it's going to be more than reputation washing. let's not be naive.
On that note, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you. You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you to the audience and everyone that joined us here today. And if you can't get enough of room for discussion, well, you're in luck. On the 11th of March from 1 to 2 right here, Jan Eliasson, former president of the United Nations General Assembly, will be joining us virtually to speak on his experiences in international mediation and the future of multilateralism and the UN.
On the 17th of March, we'll have the honor of hosting Kenneth Roth, former executive director of the Human Rights Watch, in conversation about current human rights violations and how human rights organizations navigate political pressure and global conflicts. And if you'd like to be sitting here on this couch, our applications are open up until the 16th of March. They'll close then. We hope to see your applications there. And
for now, thank you once again. This was a true pleasure. Please join us in giving a final round of applause for Marietje Schaake.
Thank you.